Hey everyone, this is the third chapter from Charles Bettelheim's Class Struggles in the USSR 3, 1930, the third period, 1930 to 1941, Part 1, The Dominated. I have finished chapters 1 and 2 of the book. The first chapter is titled, quote, The Socialist Transformation of Agriculture, end quote, and the Class Struggles. Chapter 2 was titled, quote, Socialist, end quote, Agriculture in the 1930s. There's a couple missing pages from that. And this chapter is titled The Kolkhoz System. Now, I'll probably have to read this in multiple goes, over the course of multiple videos, because it's over 40 pages long. But I think I think it'll be an very interesting piece, because that's one of the things that I'm personally curious about when discussing, where the production relations in the USSR is. Like, an important thing is understanding what is the nature of the kolkhoz, the collective farm, which is distinct from the state farm. What was the nature of the exchange that went on between the Soviet state and the kolkhozes? That's very interesting to me. So that's what I'm hoping to find out a little bit about. Obviously, there's probably more kind of like straightforward, academic, nonpartisan accounts of this, but I think what Charles Bettelheim has to say is very interesting. So. Okay, so here we go. The new social relationships which developed during the period of collectivization were much more complex than official accounts suggest. To grasp this complexity, it is necessary to examine not only the working of simply the isolated kolkhoz, which is a false abstraction, but rather that of the kolkhoz system. True, this system included the kolkhoz, the quote collective farm, end quote, but the kolkhoz system also included the party and state organs which managed the kolkhozes and the so-called quote individual holdings, end quote, of the kolkhozniks, from which the kolkhozniks drew a great part and sometimes the essential part of their subsistence. At the end of the 1930s, the kolkhoz on average disposed of more than 600 hectares of cultivated land, against 72 in 1928, on which worked about 80 kolkhoznik families. The work was organized in a, quote, industrial, end quote, way, following capitalist forms of the organization of labor in teams and in specialized brigades put under the authority of supervisory personnel. The work was collective and was carried out with the help of a certain number of machines. However, in 1940, the level of mechanization in agriculture was still quite low, scarcely more than 2 tractors on average per kolkhoz.
Tom?
Yeah.
Do you need a card, or do you have a card?
No.
Should I put your name on my card?
Yeah, you can. I might. You don't have to. Just put put your name on it.
You sure?
Yeah, I'm gonna go out and get, something soon.
Oh, okay. All right, well, all right.
All right, thank you. Sorry about that. All right, so hold on. I gotta get to a footnote. God, aren't my recordings like such a joy to listen to? come on, you son of a gun. I hate endnotes so much. Endnotes are the stupidest thing in the world. I don't care what anyone says about, oh, it clutters up the text. Fuck that. I like the citation right there. It's a footnote. For the scale of kolkhozes in 1940 and their equipment, see some citation from, I guess, some Russian archive. Additionally, these tractors, like the other major equipment, did not belong to the kolkhozes but to an external organization, the MTS, which is what? Motor Tractor Station? I think it might be Machine Tractor Station. Anyway. Yeah, Machine Tractor Station, that's what it's called, refers to. Anyway. Additionally, these tractors, like the other major equipment, did not belong to the kolkhozes but to an external organization, the MTS, which operated them according to directives coming from the managing economic and political organizations. Consequently, the immediate producers were reduced to the role of simple executants, placed in the production process organized by those who had effective possession of the means of production, that is, the cadres of the kolkhoz, and even more, the cadres of the bodies directing the kolkhoz system. It's interesting that use of the word executant. I don't know French, and I know Charles Bettelheim French, but that was always the word that Socialisme ou Barbarie used to describe state capitalism. Obviously, I think their understanding of capitalism and their understanding of state capitalism was a little less developed than Bettelheim, especially if Bettelheim, because the Socialisme ou Barbarie didn't really give much attention to like value categories at all, like didn't really think about capital in terms of like a commercial circuit, necessarily being a commercial circuit, whereas Bettelheim and I suppose Chettopadhyay did. But they always put their main emphasis on their state capitalism theory was the distinction between order givers and order takers, which I think they used the word director and executants. And so it's interesting to see that word here. So maybe that's just a common word to use in French, but it seems like, in my experience, I associate it with Socialisme ou Barbarie and Cornelius Castoriadis in particular. Anyway, section 1. The, quote, individual auxiliary economy, end quote. The term, quote, individual auxiliary economy is, end quote, is misleading. The term individual auxiliary economy suggests that the latter was only a simple appendage of the, quote, collective economy, end quote. But it was much more than that. The individual auxiliary economy was an essential part of the kolkhoz system, without which the kolkhoz system could not survive. The term, quote, individual, unquote, obscured another reality, namely the familial nature of the plot and the livestock which kolkhoz households could have at their disposal. So it is better to talk about the, quote, individual holdings, end quote, of the kolkhozniks. At the level of the work process, this type of agriculture depended on a division of labor limited to the family and essentially to the nuclear family constituted by a couple and their young children. In certain cases and in certain regions, for example in Central Asia, members of the wider family could participate in this division of labor. The size that this familiar agriculture could attain was reduced by regulatory measures. The latter also fixed the conditions under which the products of the individual holding could be sold on the free market, parenthesis, called the, quote, kolkhoz market, end quote, end parenthesis. The history of this regulation is complicated. Only some features which illuminate the conditions under which the kolkhoz system was developed will be reviewed here, At the beginning of collectivization from above in 1929, some attempts at, quote, integral collectivization, end quote, were made which would not have left any, quote, auxiliary, end quote, economy. However, from 1930 it was officially acknowledged that, given the way in which kolkhozes operated and the obligations to which the kolkhozes were subjected, the, quote, auxiliary economy, end quote, was a vital necessity. It was to help supply the kolkhozniks and also the towns. New heading, heading A, the plot, family, livestock, and the kolkhoz market. On the 2nd of March 1930, Pravda published an obligatory draft statute for kolkhozes. This statute attributed the land of the kolkhozniks to the kolkhoz, parenthesis, which was required to take the form of a, quote, artel, end quote, in other words, of the traditional Russian cooperative, end parenthesis. But this statute left to the kolkhozniks the personal possession of the kolkhoznik's house, quote, individual plot, end quote, a few fowl and several head of livestock. Footnote. It may be recalled that in November 1929, a special commission appointed by the Central Committee had already recommended that there should be maintained individual plots and livestock for each kolkhoznik, but this recommendation had then been rejected. Certain provisions of the new statute were badly received by many kolkhozniks. End footnote. On October 30th, 1931, a decision of the plenum of the CC devoted to, quote, Soviet trade and the improvement of the workers' food supply, end quote, allowed, under certain conditions, kolkhozniks to sell their production directly to consumers. Footnote. See above Chapter 2, which will hopefully be on this channel before this one, if I'm not an idiot and upload this first. Anyway, end footnote. The attempt to give the state a complete hold on town-country exchanges, parenthesis, which had been intended in 1930 to 31, in parenthesis, was abandoned at this time, for the authorities acknowledged that if they wanted to take at a low price a large part of the products provided by the kolkhozes, they had not only to authorize the auxiliary economy, but to allow the kolkhozniks to sell some products on the, quote, free market, end quote, from which they could draw that minimum of monetary receipts that the, quote, collective economy, end quote, was then incapable of assuring the kolkhozniks. In relation to the initial intentions, parenthesis, of, quote, integral collectivization, end quote, and the ban on all direct sales by kolkhozniks of part of their production, end parenthesis, the real change of direction was made in 1932, when the, quote, kolkhoz market, end quote, was officially reestablished. The receipts drawn by the peasants and by the kolkhozes from sales on the, quote, kolkhoz market, end quote, grew rapidly, and even more so after a decree of May 30th, 1932, abolished the very heavy turnover tax which had been applied to these sales in 1931. Two footnotes. In fact, the reality to town-country relationship, the reality of town-country relationship was never bound to the, quote, decisions, end quote, of the authorities. Even in 1931, when, quote, the private, end quote, free market for food products was practically illegal, the, quote, private, end quote, free market represented a turnover of 6.5 billion rubles, parenthesis, an increase of more than 60% over 1930, end parenthesis. This figure equaled about 40% of the turnover achieved for the same products by the cooperatives and urban state shops. End footnote. Footnote. C. J. Whitman, The Kolkhoz Market, published in Soviet Studies, April 5, 1956. One second. End footnote. Nevertheless, it must be noted that right up to the beginning of the second five-year plan, which happened between 1933 and 1937, the right of kolkhozniks to have their own of individual livestock was far from being respected by local authorities, who were still prepared to completely expropriate peasants, which led the peasants to slaughter their livestock. Thus, on February 19, 1933, Stalin had put it in a few words at the Congress of Kolkhoz, quote, shock workers, end quote. Stalin's contribution had a tone of false irony. Thus, Stalin declared, quote, it was not so long ago that there existed a small misunderstanding between the Soviet government and the kolkhozniks. This misunderstanding concerned the cow. But now the business has been settled and the misunderstanding has been put right. We have achieved a situation in which the majority of kolkhoz households already have one cow. Another year or two and there will not be a single kolkhoznik without his own cow, end quote. Stalin. Footnote. In fact, these were the kolkhozniks who were involved in cattle raising and wanted the cattle... In fact, these were the kolkhozniks who were involved in cattle raising and wanted the latter to be, quote, individual, end quote, hoping to thereby ensure that their households would have some of the resulting food products. The resistance of women kolkhozniks to collectivization of livestock led to numerous acts of, quote, violence and even uprisings. End footnote. In reality, what the kolkhozniks obtained through a series of decrees was not only the right to possess, quote, one cow, end quote, but of an individual livestock establishment, 1 cow, 2 calves, a sow, and piglets, 10 sheep, parenthesis, maximum, and parenthesis, an unlimited number of fowl, 20 beehives, parenthesis, at most, and parenthesis, and in addition a certain area of cultivatable land which could be as much as a quarter or half hectare, and sometimes even more. End footnote. Footnote. Not end footnote, footnote. Mainly by the decree of June 15, 1933. See also Mikolendo and Nikitin, something in Russian. End footnote. Footnote. These, quote, rights of the kolkhozniks were included in the kolkhoz statutes, which took form legally in February of 1935. These statutes were adopted by a Congress of kolkhozniks. On these points, see K.E. Wadakin, The Private Sector in Soviet Agriculture, and H. Ronsky's Rémunération et niveau de vie dans les kolkhozes. End footnote. In spite of the limitations placed on their size, quote, individual and, quote, livestock and plots tended to play an important part, while being the source of deep contradictions within the, quote, kolkhoz system, end quote. On several occasions, these contradictions and the attempt of the authorities to, quote, control, end quote, the totality of agricultural production gave rise to, quote, offensives, end quote, against, quote, private activities, end quote. Footnote. On the eve of war in 1939, a law was promulgated to limit the, quote, encroachment, end quote, of, quote, non-collectivized, end quote, activities. Other measures were taken to limit individual livestock and income not originating from, quote, collective work, end quote. Thus, new taxes and compulsory deliveries were imposed on products from, quote, non-collective, end quote, activities. End footnote. Generally, such, quote, offensives, end quote, had the effect of temporarily lowering agricultural production, making the food supply of the towns more precarious. These, quote, offensives revealed the desire of the authorities and of the exploiting class whose interests the authorities defended to subdue as far as possible the kolkhozniks and to put their hand on the greater part of the products of the kolkhozniks' labor. To put the authorities' hand on the greater part of the products of the kolkhozniks' labor. The, quote, offensives, end quote, may also be explained by the circumstance that the, quote, non-collective, end quote, activities of the kolkhozniks, parenthesis, and to a lesser extent the sovkhoz workers who also had obtained the right to cultivate a little land and raise some animals, end parenthesis, tended to take up a large part of the labor which they performed and were the origin of a quite large part of their income. Footnote. In fact, workers and employees often had a plot and a little livestock. These activities supplemented low wages, but such a supplement did not play the decisive role in the, quote, non-collective, end quote, activities of the kolkhozniks. End footnote. In sum, just before the war, the plots of the kolkhozniks were in general smaller than authorized. In 1938, each peasant family on average disposed of only 0.49 hectares. 10.4% of kolkhoz households exceeded the authorized size. Individual holdings at this period counted for only 3.9% of the sown area, and not all of them had the number of animals to which they had a right. Footnote. See article by A. Arut Yunyan. I can't read any of this. End footnote. Just wanted to see if I can find out how big hectare is compared to. So 1 hectare equals about 2.5 acres. So I guess that means what? 1.25 acres is what peasants had access to. So 1 acre, it says here, is about the size of a football field. Back to the text. New heading. Heading B. Income received by the kolkhozniks as producers in possession of a, quote, individual holding, end quote. The very circumscribed size of individual holding operations and the, quote, archaic, end quote, character of the production tools utilized in them, parentheses, swing plows, hoes, sickles, etc., in parentheses, were partly compensated by intensive and careful labor, which is above all provided by women. Footnote. Post-war investigations show that a man on average worked 36 days per year on the individual holding out of a total of 268 days worked on the farm. For a woman, the corresponding figures were 108 days on the individual holding, and yeah, that's not. Come on. I guess out of the total days worked on the farm, the women worked 292 days, which is more than men, and they worked 108 out of those days on private plots. End footnote. The small account of published information, as well as its omissions and contradictions, make it very difficult to estimate in money terms the receipts drawn by the kolkhozniks on their plots and from their individual livestock raising. However, this information is sufficient to suggest that at the end of the 1930s, the tiny, quote, familial agricultural operations, end quote, of the kolkhozniks provided them with an income equivalent or greater than that which they obtained from the enormously extensive, quote, collectivized, end quote, land. Footnote. D. Lurie admitted in Bolshevik number 22, 1934, pages 36 to 37, that the kolkhozniks drew from their plots an income greater than that coming from the kolkhoz. In 1937 and 1938, the kolkhozniks spent more than 20% of their working time in their, quote, familial agriculture, end quote, less than 80% in the, quote, collective agriculture, end quote. Even in 1964, although the prices paid to the kolkhozes had been considerably increased, 1 hour of work spent in the private holding was, quote, worth 2 or 3 times more than 1 hour spent on the, quote, collective, end quote, land. End footnote. This result was all the more remarkable in that the, quote, individual, end quote, land was cultivated, it was said, with archaic implements, and that they covered only 3.9% of the kolkhoz's sown area. Despite this, in 1937, the individual holdings provided about 21.5% of agricultural production in 1926 to 27 prices. In 1938, they provided the greater part of the monetary receipts of an average kolkhoz family and the greater part of its animal feed, potatoes, fruits, and vegetables. With grain, the kolkhozniks were for the most part supplied by the kolkhoz. Footnote. See the article by Moshe Lewin, The Kolkhoz and the Russian Music, published in Peasants in History, Essays in Honor of Daniel Thorner. Back to the text. End footnote. In 1937, individual livestock operations provided 71.4% of the milk, 70.9% of the meat, 70.4% of hides and skins, and 43% of the wool. At the time, animals belonging to kolkhozniks formed a major part of the total livestock. There's a quote from Ostrovsky, quoted by Lewin, which says, the kolkhoz in 1938, the entire private economy, familial livestock of kolkhozniks, individual peasants and wage earners, kept 32.9 million head of cattle, while the state farms and kolkhozes held 18 million. End footnote. In order to evaluate the economic role of individual agriculture on the part of the kolkhozniks, it should also be noted that the monetary receipts of these latter during the 1930s consisted largely, parentheses, 75 to 85%, end parentheses, of receipts from sales on the, quote, free market, end quote. For the prices there were several times higher than those paid by the state. Footnote, see J.F. Karst, The Soviet Rural Economy, page 55. End footnote. Most of the products sold there came from individual agriculture, with only a small fraction coming from the distribution in kind made by the kolkhozes. However, from 1937, the production from plots and from family stock was subjected to increased state exactions, which tended to reduce the share of monetary receipts coming from sales on the, quote, free market of products from individual holdings, even though the reduction in amounts sold was partly compensated by a rise of the prices at which agricultural products could be sold. Generally speaking, the, quote, familial micro-agriculture, end quote, of the kolkhozniks played a decisive role simultaneously in the supplying of citizens, the daily subsistence of families belonging to, quote, collective farms, end quote, and the obtaining by these families of a monetary income. True, the products of collective activities were indispensable for the provisioning of kolkhozniks, but the resources that they drew from these activities seemed to have been not much more than a mere complement to the incomes coming from familial agriculture. The output of familial agriculture partly entered the channels of trade through the kolkhoz market, or through transactions made with state commercial organizations and cooperatives. In addition, familial agriculture bore the weight of compulsory deliveries or various taxes. Despite the pressure thus exercised by the state to extract a, quote, surplus, end quote, from familial agriculture, the latter above all covered the needs of the peasant family. This considerably reduced the expense of the reproduction of its labor force, borne by the kolkhoz, and enabled the latter to be subordinated to the maximum extent to the demands of the state and to accumulation. Okay, so I'm going to cut it off there. That's going to be the first part. This is going to be the first video. Yeah. 1 second. Sorry, 1 second. I'm lost. Okay. Yes, thanks for listening.